Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came at 11:47 p.m. This should have been my first warning. I am Hollis Peregrine Brannick. 14 years of crime scene cleanup experience had taught me one thing clearly. Unless someone was desperate enough to push professional boundaries, legitimate jobs never came before midnight. The voice on the phone belonged to a realtor. He spoke quickly, in short bursts, as if he'd rehearsed this conversation in his head for hours and had to get every word out before his courage failed him. "A house in Willow Creek Estates," he said. "It's been vacant for 6 years. It's failed to sell 3 times. The bank wants a thorough cleaning before putting it back on the market. If you start tomorrow, no. If you can start tonight, they'll pay double your usual rate." When I asked why it was so urgent, there was silence. Such a long silence that I thought the line had gone dead. Then a voice almost in a whisper, "Because I can't go back there alone, and the last cleaner isn't answering my calls." I should have said no. Every instinct I'd developed over 14 years of walking into places where death had occurred was screaming at me to decline, to recommend another service, to let this particular job find someone else. But she mentioned the rate again. Triple, actually, if I could have preliminary findings by morning. And I had equipment payments due and a daughter starting college in the fall. So I took the address, told her I'd do an initial assessment at first light, and tried to ignore the relief in her voice that sounded less like gratitude and more like someone passing a curse to the next person in line. Willow Creek Estates sat on the eastern edge of the county, one of those developments built during the housing boom where every house looked identical, except for minor variations in shutter color and garage placement. The address led me down a cul-de-sac that dead-ended at a wall of overgrown trees, and the target house sat at the terminus like a period at the end of a sentence no one wanted to finish reading. It was a standard colonial, vinyl siding gone gray with neglect. But something about its proportions seemed wrong in the early morning light. Windows too dark, roofline sagging slightly in the middle. The whole structure appearing to lean inward as if the house were collapsing around some invisible wound at its center. I sat in my van for longer than usual, checking my equipment, reviewing the agent's sparse notes, finding reasons to delay the approach. The neighboring houses showed signs of life. Cars in driveways, landscaping maintained, porch lights glowing against the dawn. But they all faced away from the target property, as if the entire cul-de-sac had been designed to turn its back on this one address. Even the trees seemed to bend away from it, branches reaching toward the other homes like fingers trying to pull themselves free from contaminated soil. The lockbox key stuck, and I had to force it 3 times before it turned. The door swung inward on hinges that released a sound like an exhale, and the smell that emerged wasn't the sharp tang of decay I'd expected, but something else. A dry, dusty scent with an undertone of something organic and wrong, like old flowers left too long in stagnant water. I'd smelled worse, objectively speaking, but there was a quality to this odor that made my throat constrict. Some primitive part of my brain recognizing a warning my conscious mind couldn't articulate. The interior was dim despite the morning sun, light filtering through filthy windows and seeming to dissipate before it reached the floor. Dust hung in the air in visible layers, and when I moved forward, it swirled around my legs with a heaviness that felt almost liquid. The furniture was still there, just as the agent had mentioned. A leather sofa, a dining table, built-in bookshelves, all of it covered in that same thick dust that made everything look like it had been preserved under volcanic ash. But it was the silence that struck me most. Not just quiet, but an active absence of sound, as if the house were absorbing noise rather than simply failing to produce it. I began with documentation, photographing each room from multiple angles, checking air quality readings that came back normal despite the oppressive atmosphere. The first floor revealed nothing obviously wrong. No visible staining, no signs of pest infestation, no structural damage beyond what you'd expect from years of neglect. But there were small details that accumulated into unease. The family photos on the walls were all face down, as if someone had gone through and deliberately turned each one. The books on the shelves were arranged spine inward, titles hidden. And in the kitchen, every cabinet door stood exactly 3 inches open, creating a uniform gap that seemed too precise to be accidental. The stairs to the second floor were carpeted in a beige that had darkened to brown in the center of each tread, wear patterns that suggested decades of use. But as I climbed, I noticed the pattern was wrong. The darkest wear wasn't on the outside edges where people naturally walk, but in the exact center, as if whoever had used these stairs had moved up and down with unnatural rigidity, placing each foot directly in front of the other. I found myself matching the pattern without meaning to, my feet finding those darker patches, and had to consciously force myself to step to the side. The second floor hallway was longer than it should have been. I'd seen the house from outside, knew its dimensions, but the corridor seemed to stretch beyond what the exterior walls would allow. It was a trick of perspective, had to be, shadows and dust creating an illusion of depth. But as I walked its length, I counted my steps, 23 to reach the master bedroom door, and when I looked back toward the stairs, they seemed impossibly distant, as if I'd walked the length of a warehouse rather than a suburban hallway. The master bedroom door was closed, and my hand hesitated on the knob. Through the wood, I could hear something. Not a sound exactly, but a presence, a sense of occupied space that made every hair on my arms stand rigid. I pressed my ear to the door and listened, and what I heard was breathing. Slow, measured breaths, in and out, in and out. The rhythm perfectly even in a way human breathing never is. I jerked back, checked my air quality monitor thinking maybe I was experiencing hypoxia or carbon dioxide poisoning, but the readings were normal. The breathing continued, and I realized it wasn't coming through the door. It was coming from the door itself, the wood expanding and contracting with each cycle. I opened it anyway, because that's what I do. I walk into rooms where death has occurred, where the worst of human existence has left its mark, and I clean it away. Fear is part of the job, and you learn to work through it, or you find another profession. The door swung inward smoothly, silently, and revealed a space that made me forget how to breathe myself. The room was exactly as the agent had described, and nothing like I'd expected. The bed was made with hospital precision, corners tucked with geometric exactness. A floral comforter pulled so tight it looked vacuum-sealed. 2 nightstands, a dresser, a ceiling fan hanging motionless. All of it covered in that ubiquitous dust, but arranged with a care that suggested recent attention. And the smell, that dry organic scent from downstairs, was concentrated here to the point of being almost tactile, coating the inside of my nose and mouth like a film. I approached the bed slowly, my feet finding purchase on carpet that felt wrong underfoot. Too soft in some places, resistant in others, as if the floor beneath had become uneven. The ATP luminometer was already in my hand, habit taking over when conscious thought faltered, and I began testing surfaces. The nightstand read 4200 RLU, biological contamination far above safe thresholds. The dresser top was similar, 3800 RLU. But the bed itself, when I swabbed the comforter, maxed out the device at 10,000 plus, the highest reading possible, indicating biological material so concentrated the meter couldn't measure its full extent. I pulled back the comforter and found the sheets beneath were stained, not the rust brown of old blood, but something darker, a color that seemed to shift between black and deep purple depending on the angle of light. The stain covered most of the fitted sheet in a pattern that was almost beautiful in its symmetry, radiating outward from the center in concentric rings like a target or a ripple in still water. I'd never seen decomposition staining pattern this way. Biological material follows gravity, pools in low points, spreads irregularly based on 100 variables of position and time and environmental conditions. This looked designed, intentional, as if the stain had been painted onto the fabric with careful attention to form. I was reaching for my sample collection kit when I noticed the texture. The stain wasn't just discoloration. It had depth, dimension, raised slightly from the sheet surface like scar tissue or the relief on a coin. I touched it with a gloved finger and felt it shift under the pressure. Not like dried material, but like something with elasticity, with give. I pressed harder, and the stain pushed back, a subtle resistance that made me pull my hand away. The indentation from my finger remained visible for 3 seconds, 4, 5, then slowly filled back in like memory foam returning to its original shape. That's when I saw the underneath. I'd been so focused on the stain's pattern that I'd missed what it was showing me. The image hidden in its concentric rings. It was a face, not a clear portrait, but an impression. Features suggested by the way the darker and lighter areas arranged themselves. Closed eyes, mouth slightly open, the oval of a head and the curve of shoulders. Someone had died here, and their final position had been recorded not just in the biological staining, but in the pattern itself, as if the bed had absorbed the person rather than simply being marked by their passing. I documented everything with photographs, my hands shaking enough that I had to brace the camera against the nightstand for stability. Then I began the chemical testing. Presumptive blood test came back negative. Urine, negative. Fecal matter, negative. I ran through every test in my field kit, and each one came back negative, meaning the biological material creating these massive ATP readings wasn't any of the standard human fluids I was trained to identify. I collected samples in sterile bags, labeled them with time and location, and tried to ignore the way they felt warm in my hands, despite having come from a room that was, according to my thermometer, a constant 54 degrees. The closet door was open, and inside I found clothes still hanging, women's clothes, dated but well maintained, arranged by color with mathematical spacing between each hanger. The floor of the closet was bare, except for a single pair of shoes positioned precisely in the center, toes pointing outward toward the door. But it was the walls of the closet that stopped me completely. They were covered in writing, not graffiti or the random scrawls of vandalism, but text, thousands upon thousands of words written in what appeared to be the same dark substance that stained the bed sheets. I stepped closer, pulled out my flashlight, and began to read. The writing was in English, a woman's handwriting from what I could determine, but the content made no immediate sense. It was the same phrase repeated with slight variations, filling every available surface of the closet walls, written over itself in layers so thick the earliest inscriptions were barely visible beneath the accumulation. Help me, I'm still here, help me, I can't leave. Help me, please someone help me, I'm still here, I'm still here, I'm still here. The repetition continued in an expanding spiral that started at eye level and worked its way down to the baseboard and up to the ceiling. The handwriting degrading as it went, becoming less controlled, more frantic, letters bleeding into each other until the final inscriptions at the very top of the closet were barely recognizable as language at all, just desperate scratches in the biological medium that carried the weight of the message even when the words became illegible. I photographed every surface of the closet, then began taking samples of the writing. The substance flaked away easily under my scalpel, and when I examined it under my portable microscope, I found cellular material, human skin cells, definitely, but degraded beyond any normal decomposition pattern I'd encountered. They looked almost mummified, desiccated to the point of being crystalline, but they still registered on the ATP meter as biologically active, still contained enough viable material to produce those staggering contamination readings. I backed out of the closet and surveyed the room again with this new understanding. Someone had been trapped here, maybe not physically, but psychologically, emotionally, in whatever way desperation can trap a person, and they'd spent what might have been days, weeks, months writing their plea for help on every surface they could reach. The bed staining, the closet walls, the elevated ATP readings throughout the room, all of it was evidence of a prolonged presence, a slow dissolution of a person into their environment. I checked the police reports on my phone, the original incident documentation from 6 years ago when the death had been discovered and investigated. The file was sparse. Accidental overdose, prescription medication interaction, victim found unresponsive in bed by spouse returning from a business trip. Medical examiner had ruled it accidental, no signs of trauma, no indication of anything beyond a tragic medication error. The house had been cleared for occupancy, and the family had moved out within the week, abandoning most of their possessions and never returning. But standing in this room, seeing the evidence the original investigators had somehow missed or chosen to ignore, I knew the official story was incomplete at best. The writing in the closet predated the death. The layers of inscription suggested months of accumulation, message written over message in a desperate attempt to communicate something that no one was hearing. And the bed staining with its perfect symmetry and that impossibly preserved face, that wasn't the pattern of someone who had simply failed to wake up from sleep. That was the pattern of someone who had been dying by degrees, slowly enough to leave an imprint, gradually enough that their final position became a template burned into the physical space. I moved to the windows, checking for any signs of barrier or restraint, any physical evidence that might explain the desperate tone of the closet writing. The windows were unlocked, opened easily when I tested them. The bedroom door had no external lock, no sign it had ever been secured from the outside. The room itself had no features that would prevent someone from leaving if they chose to. But on the windowsill, barely visible beneath the accumulated dust, were scratch marks, deep gouges in the wood that suggested fingernails, someone clawing at the sill despite the window being operational and unlocked. I tested the scratch marks with a presumptive blood reagent and got a positive result. Finally, something that matched a standard contamination pattern. There was blood in those scratches, old and oxidized but definitely present. Someone had stood at this window, possibly looking out at the neighbors who lived their normal lives just yards away, and had clawed at the sill hard enough to break through their own fingernails and leave blood in the wood grain. Not trying to open a locked window, but doing something else, leaving a mark, creating evidence, documenting their presence in a way that might outlast their voice. The bathroom adjoining the master bedroom was pristine by comparison, and that was somehow worse than if it had been contaminated. It had been cleaned recently, not 6 years ago when the house was abandoned, but recently within the last few months based on the chemical traces I detected with my field tests. Someone had been maintaining this bathroom, keeping it spotless, while the rest of the house decayed around it. The fixtures gleamed, the mirror was streak-free, and the toilet bowl looked like it had been scrubbed with commercial-grade cleaners. But the drain in the shower told a different story. I removed the drain cover and found an accumulation of hair, long, dark hair that had been caught in the trap and never removed. I pulled it out in clumps, finding more and more as I worked, until I'd extracted what had to be months or years worth of hair loss. The quantity was impossible for normal shedding. This was the kind of hair loss you'd see from extreme stress or illness, the body shutting down non-essential functions and releasing everything it could spare. I bagged it as evidence, noting the way it felt unusually brittle, the way it broke apart in my gloved hands like it had been chemically treated or exposed to something that had degraded its structure. I was sealing the evidence bag when I heard the breathing again. This time, it was coming from the bathroom mirror, condensation forming and dissipating in rhythm with those same measured inhales and exhales. I watched frost patterns appear on the glass despite the room temperature being well above freezing. Watched them form shapes that might have been random, or might have been letters, might have been nothing, or might have been another message from whoever had spent their final days writing pleas for help that no one had answered. I left the bathroom and returned to the bedroom, intent on finishing my documentation and getting out. But the room had changed in the minutes I'd been gone. The bed was different. Not obviously so, but in small ways that accumulated into certainty that something had moved. The comforter was pulled tighter, tucked more severely at the corners. The pillows were arranged differently, positioned with even more precision than before, and the stain on the sheets visible where I'd pulled back the comforter had spread. Not dramatically, but measurably. The outer rings were larger, reaching closer to the edges of the mattress, as if the biological material was still active, still expanding, still claiming more territory. I photographed the changes, compared them to my earlier images, and confirmed what I was seeing wasn't imagination or fatigue. The contamination was progressing, growing, spreading in real time despite the source of the biological material being long dead and removed from the property. This shouldn't be possible. Contamination is static, fixed at the moment of death, and then slowly degrading over time. It doesn't expand years later. It doesn't organize itself into patterns. It doesn't respond to observation by becoming more present. That's when I found the photos. They'd been in the dresser drawer all along, but I'd been so focused on the bed and closet that I'd missed them. A stack of photographs, dozens of them, showing the bedroom at different stages. The earliest ones were dated, timestamps in the corner indicating they'd been taken over a period of months, always at night based on the darkness visible through the windows. They showed the bed, always the bed, with the stain growing larger in each successive image. The first photo showed a small discoloration, barely visible. The next showed it slightly larger, then larger still, the progression documented with the kind of obsessive attention that suggested ritual rather than mere record-keeping. But it was the later photographs that made my hands shake. They showed the room as it was now, bed made with that same geometric precision, stain in full development, closet door open to reveal the writing within. These photos were dated from last month, last week, yesterday. Someone had been coming into this abandoned house, into this contaminated room, and photographing the progression of the stain like they were nurturing something, watching it grow, tending to its development with parental care. I turned over the last photograph and found writing on the back, the same hand that had covered the closet walls. She's almost ready. She's almost strong enough. She's almost here again. I read it 3 times, trying to extract sense from the words, trying to understand what ready meant, what strong enough referred to, what here again could possibly indicate. The photograph showed the bed as it appeared in this moment, stain at full development, and if the progression in the images was accurate, this was the end point. The completion of whatever process had been unfolding over months or years of careful documentation. I needed to leave. Every protocol I'd ever learned, every instinct honed over 14 years of this work, was telling me to evacuate the scene, call the authorities, let someone else determine what was happening in this room. But I had one more task to complete: sample collection from the bed stain itself, the actual contaminated material that was creating those impossible ATP readings. I approached the bed again, scalpel in hand, and reached toward the stain. The moment my scalpel touched the surface, the stain moved. Not the slow expansion I'd observed earlier, but a rapid contraction, pulling away from the blade like living tissue recoiling from pain. I jerked back, watched as the stain settled again, spreading back to its full extent, but with a new quality, an awareness, a responsiveness that biological residue should not possess. I tried again, approaching from a different angle, and got the same result. The stain withdrew from the scalpel, then slowly returned to its position like something breathing, like something with volition. I abandoned the attempt at sampling and instead pulled back the fitted sheet entirely, wanting to see what was beneath, what the mattress itself might reveal. The sheet resisted, stuck to the mattress surface with an adhesive quality that required force to overcome. When it finally released, I saw that the stain had penetrated completely through the sheet and into the mattress below. But the pattern on the mattress was different. Not concentric rings, but text, the same desperate plea repeated in letters formed by the dark, biological substance. Help me, help me, help me, help me, filling every visible inch of the mattress surface. I stared at it, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with any rational explanation. Decomposition doesn't write messages. Biological contamination doesn't form letters. There had to be another answer. Someone had been staging this scene, creating these patterns deliberately, using biological material harvested from somewhere to construct an elaborate hoax. But the ATP readings didn't support that theory. The material was genuinely biological, genuinely human, and genuinely active in ways that suggested ongoing cellular processes rather than preserved or manipulated residue. The temperature in the room was dropping. I could see my breath now, watch it materialize in the air and hang there longer than physics should allow, drifting toward the bed like it was being drawn by some gravitational force emanating from the stain. My thermometer confirmed what I was feeling. The room had dropped 15 degrees in the last 5 minutes, falling from 54 to 39 degrees with no apparent source for the temperature change. The windows were closed, the HVAC system wasn't running, but the air was growing colder by the second, frost beginning to form on the metal bed frame and the surface of the dresser mirror. I started backing toward the door, equipment forgotten, driven by a primal need to remove myself from this space, but the bedroom door was closing. Slowly, incrementally, the gap narrowing by inches as I watched. Not slamming, not swinging shut with force, but easing closed with the same measured pace as that breathing I'd heard earlier. I lunged for it, got my hand in the gap before it could close completely, and pulled it back open against resistance that felt less like a draft and more like opposition. Like the house itself was trying to seal me inside. I got through the door and into the hallway, and immediately the temperature normalized, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. I looked back into the bedroom and saw it had changed again. The bed was different. The closet door had closed, and standing at the window was a shape. A darkness against the dim light that had a vaguely human silhouette. It didn't move, didn't turn toward me, just stood there facing the window with the same posture I imagined the victim had taken when she'd clawed at the sill and left blood in the scratch marks. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. Down that impossible hallway that seemed shorter now, down the stairs taking them 3 at a time, through the first floor where all the cabinet doors I'd noted earlier were now closed, latched tight as if they'd never been open. I hit the front door at full speed, threw it open, and burst out into the morning sunlight that felt like salvation, like emergence from drowning, like the first breath after suffocation. I sat in my van for 20 minutes before I could trust my hands to operate the equipment, before I could pull out my phone and call the agent. She answered on the first ring, voice tight with anticipation. I told her I couldn't take the job, that the contamination was beyond my scope, that she needed to contact the authorities and have the property investigated thoroughly before anyone else entered. There was a long silence, and then she asked the question I'd been dreading. What did you find? I didn't know how to answer. I'd found biological contamination that defied normal patterns, writing that documented desperation, a stain that responded to touch like living tissue, and a presence that seemed to occupy the space as thoroughly as any living resident. I'd found evidence that the official death investigation had missed something crucial, that whatever had happened in that bedroom was far more complex than a simple medication overdose. But mostly, I'd found something that shouldn't exist. Biological material that was somehow still active years after death. Still expanding, still documenting the victim's final message with an obsessive attention that suggested intention rather than random contamination. I told her I'd send my preliminary report and that she should take it to the police, to the medical examiner, to anyone who might be able to make sense of what was in that house. She agreed quickly, too quickly with the relief of someone who'd expected worse news. We ended the call, and I sat there in the van looking at the house that had defeated me, that had sent me running like I was fresh out of training rather than a veteran of hundreds of death scenes. The contamination report I filed was the most detailed of my career. I documented every ATP reading, every photograph, every sample I'd collected. I described the stain pattern, the closet writing, the photographs I'd found, the temperature changes, and the door closing on its own. I noted the discrepancies with the official death investigation and recommended a comprehensive forensic re-examination of the scene. I included everything except the shape I'd seen at the window, the way the stain had recoiled from my scalpel, the breathing I'd heard from the walls, details that crossed the line from observable phenomena into territory that would undermine my credibility and mark the entire report as unreliable. The agent never responded to the report. I followed up 3 times over the next week, leaving messages that went unanswered, sending emails that bounced back as undeliverable. I tried calling the real estate office, but the receptionist claimed no one by that name worked there, had never worked there, and suggested I had the wrong company. I checked the address I'd been given, and the property record showed the house was still bank-owned, still unsold, no agent of record assigned to the listing. I drove back to Willow Creek Estates 2 weeks later, driven by a need to confirm what I'd experienced, to verify that the house was real even if the agent wasn't. The cul-de-sac looked the same, neighboring homes maintained and occupied, the target property declining at the end of the street. But there was a change. The for sale sign was gone, and in the front window, curtains had been drawn. Not the dusty, abandoned curtains I'd seen before, but clean white curtains, pulled back to let in light, suggesting occupancy. I parked and approached the front door, and before I could knock, it opened. A woman stood there, middle-aged, with dark hair and a familiar face. Familiar because I'd seen it in those family photos in the house. Familiar because I'd seen its impression in the stain on the bedsheets. She looked at me with no recognition, no awareness that she should be dead, that her body had been removed from this house 6 years ago and buried or cremated according to whatever arrangements her family had made. She smiled, a normal suburban greeting, and asked if she could help me. I stumbled through an excuse about having the wrong address, about looking for a property that was for sale. She told me nothing in the neighborhood was on the market, that it was a stable area where people bought and stayed, where turnover was rare, and neighbors knew each other for decades. I thanked her, apologized for the confusion, and backed away toward my van. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw her still standing in the doorway, watching me leave. And behind her, visible through the open door, I could see the living room I'd documented. The same furniture, the same layout, but lived in now, occupied, with the television on and mail on the side table, and all the signs of normal domestic life. Except the family photos on the walls were still face down, and the books on the shelves were still spine inward, and every cabinet door in the visible kitchen stood exactly 3 inches open. I never went back. I never filed a police report about the woman who answered the door, never tried to verify whether she was who I thought she was or just bore an unfortunate resemblance to the deceased. I never followed up on the samples I'd collected, never checked whether the lab analysis revealed anything that might explain the impossible ATP readings or the active quality of the biological material. I just added the house to my internal list of places I would never enter again and tried to move forward. But the case won't close in my mind. I think about that bedroom constantly, about the stain that grew and responded and documented its own progression. I think about the closet writing, that desperate plea repeated until the words lost meaning and became pure expression of trapped desperation. I think about the photographs showing the contamination developing over months, being tended and documented like something precious. And I think about the woman who answered the door, alive and occupying a house where she'd died, as if death itself had been reversed or rendered irrelevant by whatever was happening in that master bedroom. The most disturbing possibility is that the official death investigation was accurate. She did die from a medication interaction, did pass away in that bed 6 years ago. But somehow, through the accumulation of biological material and desperate intention and obsessive documentation, something of her had been preserved. Not a ghost or spirit, nothing supernatural, nothing that violated the physical laws I understood, but a biological persistence, a cellular memory strong enough to maintain presence, to continue expanding, to eventually reconstitute into something that could answer a door and smile at strangers and live a simulacrum of normal life. The alternative, that the woman I saw was someone else, a new occupant who happened to look like the deceased, who happened to maintain the same odd arrangements of photos and books and cabinet doors, was somehow less comforting. Because if the house attracted people who matched its previous occupant, if it drew in replacements to perpetuate whatever pattern had been established, then the contamination wasn't just biological, it was mimetic, infectious in a way that spread beyond physical material into behavior and presence and identity itself. I still have the samples I collected, sealed in evidence bags in my office safe. I've never submitted them for analysis, never tried to determine what they might reveal about the nature of the contamination. Because some knowledge creates obligations to report, to investigate, to act on what you've learned, and I'm not ready to face what those obligations might require. The ATP readings were real. The photographs documented actual progression, and the woman who answered the door was either impossibly alive or impossibly similar to someone dead. Either way, submitting those samples for analysis would force me to choose which impossibility to accept. The house in Willow Creek Estates remains unsellable, according to public records. The listing appears and disappears from real estate databases, the price dropping steadily with each failed attempt to attract buyers. But I know now that it's not really for sale. It's full, occupied by whatever reconstituted itself in that bedroom over 6 years of biological accumulation and desperate inscription. The house has what it wants, has maintained its occupant through means I can't explain and don't want to understand. That's why I'll never go back. Why I decline any jobs in that neighborhood. Why I've added Willow Creek Estates to my list of places where my expertise has limits. Because I learned something in that master bedroom that no amount of training or experience had prepared me for. Sometimes the contamination doesn't need cleaning. Sometimes it needs to be left alone, allowed to complete whatever process it's engaged in, permitted to maintain its presence without intervention or documentation. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is walk away, seal your evidence, and let the house keep its secrets. And sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I wonder about other houses I've cleaned, other scenes I've remediated. I wonder if I've disrupted processes I didn't understand, if I've interrupted biological persistence that was trying to maintain something beyond death. I wonder if somewhere, in some house I've declared clean and safe, something is slowly accumulating again, writing its message on walls I painted over, leaving its impression in carpets I removed, documenting its presence in ways that will only become visible after I'm long gone. That's the real contamination, the awareness that cleaning might be interruption rather than resolution, that the biological material I remove might be evidence of continuation rather than ending. The house in Willow Creek taught me that death doesn't always mean cessation, that under the right conditions, with enough desperation and time and obsessive attention, something can persist beyond the failure of the body. And once you've seen that persistence, once you've documented its progression and felt it respond to your presence, you can't unknow it. You can only choose which houses to enter and which to avoid, which contamination to clean and which to leave undisturbed. The woman who answered the door haunts me more than any corpse I've ever processed, more than any decomposition scene I've remediated, because corpses are honest. They're evidence of an ending, documentation of cessation. But that woman, alive or reconstituted or impossibly preserved, was evidence of something else, a refusal to end, a biological determination to persist, a contamination so thorough it had consumed death itself and emerged on the other side as something that could smile and speak and maintain a household. I keep the evidence bag sealed. I keep the photographs filed away. I keep the memory of that bedroom locked down except for these late nights when it surfaces despite my efforts to contain it. And I never accept jobs in Willow Creek Estates, no matter the rate offered, no matter the desperation in the caller's voice. Because I know what's in that house at the end of the cul-de-sac, and I know it doesn't need cleaning. It needs to be left alone, undocumented, unexamined, a contamination so complete that intervention would only spread it further, would only risk releasing whatever has been carefully accumulated and preserved in that master bedroom over 6 years of impossible persistence. That's the house I'll never enter again, not because I failed to clean it, I never got the chance to try, but because I saw what it was becoming, what it had already achieved, and I understood that some contamination is beyond remediation. Some biological material doesn't follow the rules of death and decay. Some presences refuse to be removed, no matter how thoroughly you scrub, no matter how precisely you document, no matter how completely you understand the protocols of cleaning. And when you encounter that kind of contamination, the only professional response is to seal the door and walk away, carrying the knowledge alone because sharing it would only spread the impossibility to others. The house is full now. The contamination is complete. And somewhere in that master bedroom, a stain continues to grow, writing continues to accumulate on closet walls, and biological material continues to maintain a presence that should have ended 6 years ago. I cleaned hundreds of death scenes before that one, and I've cleaned dozens since. But I've never encountered anything like what was happening in that bedroom, and I pray I never will again. Because the worst contamination isn't what death leaves behind. It's what refuses to leave, what persists and grows and reconstitutes itself into something that can answer doors and smile at strangers and pretend that dying was nothing more than a temporary interruption in an existence that continues regardless of biological cessation. That's what I found in Willow Creek Estates. That's what I left behind when I ran from that bedroom, when I sealed my evidence and declined to analyze it, when I chose ignorance over understanding. And that's what I carry with me still. The knowledge that somewhere, in an unsellable house at the end of a cul-de-sac, something that was once a woman continues to exist in defiance of every law of biology and death that I thought I understood. The contamination is complete. The house is occupied, and I will never, never enter it again. The smell reached me while I was still in my van, half a mile down the gravel road that wound through the pine forest toward the isolated farmhouse. I'm Zebulon Creed Harrow, and I've been cleaning death scenes for 9 years, long enough to catalog every variation of decomposition, every chemical signature of human expiration. But this was different. This was chemical sharpness mixed with organic decay, like someone had tried to sterilize death itself and only succeeded in creating something worse, something that didn't belong in the natural order of how things end. The smell made my eyes water, even through the van's air filtration system, made something primitive in my brain scream warnings I couldn't articulate. The deputy who'd called me was waiting at the property line, his cruiser parked sideways across the driveway like a barricade. He stood outside the vehicle, a handkerchief pressed to his face, and even from a distance I could see the tremor in his hands. When I pulled up beside him and rolled down my window, the smell intensified, sharp enough to taste, thick enough to feel coating the inside of my throat. He lowered the handkerchief just long enough to speak, his voice hoarse like he'd been breathing through his mouth for hours. "Can't go in there without proper equipment," he said. "We tried. Made it maybe 30 seconds before the chemical exposure got too bad. Coroner took the body out 3 days ago, but whatever's in that house, it's still active, still producing fumes." I asked him what they'd found, and his eyes went distant, unfocused, like he was looking at something that lived behind his eyelids now. "Wrong," he said finally. "Everything about it is wrong. The body, the scene, the way the house feels. Medical examiner said natural causes, maybe 2 weeks decomposition, but the scene doesn't match. Nothing matches." He handed me a file folder through the window, wouldn't let his hand linger close to mine, pulled back fast, like proximity might be contagious. "Read the initial report, then decide if you want to go in. Last specialist we called took one look and drove away without even getting his equipment out." I read the report sitting in my van with the windows up and the air recirculating, trying to filter out that chemical organic stench while I absorbed what the first responders had documented. Male, approximately 50 years old, found in the upstairs bedroom after neighbors reported persistent odors. Estimated 2 weeks post-mortem based on decomposition indicators. But here's what made my skin prickle. The report noted extensive chemical contamination throughout the structure and evidence of amateur decontamination attempts pre-discovery. Someone had found the body, and instead of calling authorities, they'd tried to clean it themselves. Tried and failed so catastrophically that the house was now a toxic environment, unsafe for entry without hazmat protocols. I suited up in full PPE, Tyvek coverall, double-layered nitrile gloves, boot covers, and my most aggressive respirator setup. Full-face mask with CBRN filters designed to handle chemical warfare agents. If someone had misused industrial chemicals in that house, if they'd created toxic compounds through ignorance or panic, I needed protection that could handle worst-case scenarios. The deputy watched me prepare and shook his head slowly, like he was watching someone make a terrible mistake but didn't have the energy to intervene. "Your funeral," he said quietly. Then louder. Radio check every 15 minutes. If you miss one, I'm calling in the hazmat team from the county. The house was a weathered 2-story farmhouse, probably built in the 1950s, and slowly deteriorating ever since. White paint peeled in long strips from the siding, revealing gray wood beneath. The front porch sagged in the middle, boards warped from decades of rain and neglect. Every window was dark, and I noticed they'd been covered from inside. Sheets or blankets blocking out light, creating the kind of darkness that felt intentional, like someone had wanted to hide what was happening in there even from the sun. The front door stood slightly ajar, yellow police tape stretched across the frame but not sealed, moving slightly in the breeze like it was breathing. I pushed through the tape and entered, and immediately understood why the deputy had warned me. The chemical smell was overwhelming even through my filters. Chlorine, definitely, in concentrations that made my eyes water and created a burning sensation in my sinuses despite the full face protection. But underneath the chemical assault was something organic, something sweet and wrong that spoke to decomposition in ways that went beyond normal post-mortem processes. The air was thick, visible almost, particulates suspended in it that caught the light from my headlamp and created a fog-like effect that made depth perception difficult. The first floor had been scrubbed. I could see it immediately. Water stains on the walls running from ceiling to baseboard. Puddles of chemical residue dried into crystalline patches on the hardwood floors. Furniture pushed against the walls and showing splash patterns where liquid had been thrown with force. Someone had gone through this space with buckets of bleach, throwing it at every surface, drenching the room in chemical solution like they were trying to exorcise something rather than clean it. The wood floors were damaged, the grain raised and splintered where the harsh chemicals had eaten into the finish. The walls showed discoloration, paint bubbling and peeling in sheets where the bleach had reacted with whatever lay beneath. I began documenting with my camera, and the flash created strange effects in the chemical haze. Light refracting through the particulate matter, creating halos and shadows that made the room seem to shift and move even when I stood still. My air quality monitor was screaming warnings. Chlorine gas at dangerous levels, volatile organic compounds off the scale, particulate matter in the red zone. This wasn't just a contaminated scene. This was an active chemical hazard that should have been evacuated and sealed by EPA protocols. But here I was, walking through it, documenting the evidence of someone's catastrophic attempt to erase what had happened in this house. I found the source of some of the chemicals under the kitchen sink. Industrial bleach containers, the kind you buy in bulk from janitorial supply stores, at least 20 empty gallon jugs lined up like soldiers. More empties were stacked in the corner near the back door. I counted 43 bottles total, representing over 50 gallons of sodium hypochlorite solution dumped into this house's enclosed spaces. That much bleach, improperly used, could create chlorine gas concentrations capable of permanent lung damage or death. Whoever had done this cleaning hadn't just been desperate. They'd been suicidal in their desperation, willing to risk fatal chemical exposure rather than face whatever they were trying to hide. The stairs to the second floor were saturated with bleach residue. The carpet runner stiff and discolored, crunching under my boots like it had been crystallized by chemical exposure. As I climbed, I noticed something odd. Handprints on the walls, preserved in bleach staining, small hands pressed against the wallpaper like someone had been steadying themselves or reaching out for support. The prints were everywhere, overlapping in some places, creating patterns that suggested someone had moved up and down these stairs multiple times while covered in chemical solution, leaving their mark with each pass. The second-floor hallway was darker, the windows here completely blocked, no natural light penetrating the heavy coverings. My headlamp cut through the chemical fog, and I saw more evidence of aggressive cleaning. The walls showed those same vertical water stains, The floor had pooled residue dried into irregular shapes, and every door stood open except one at the end of the hall. The master bedroom, according to the floor plan the deputy had provided. The death scene. I moved toward it slowly, checking my air quality readings with each step, watching the numbers climb as I got closer to that closed door. I paused outside the bedroom and performed another radio check. The deputy's voice came through, scratchy, distant, asking if I was okay. I told him I was proceeding to the primary scene, and he responded with silence that lasted so long I thought I'd lost the connection. Then, "Be careful in there. The coroner wouldn't tell me what he saw, but he's been a medical examiner for 20 years, and I watched him cry when he came out of that room." The radio clicked off, and I was alone with the closed door and the chemical smell that was so strong here it felt like a physical barrier I had to push through. I opened the door and understood immediately why the coroner had cried. The room beyond was a testament to panic and failed concealment, a space where someone had tried desperately to erase evidence and had only succeeded in preserving it in a different, more terrible form. Every surface had been drenched in bleach. The walls were streaked with it. The floor was covered in dried pools of it. The furniture was saturated with it. But the chemical treatment hadn't eliminated the biological contamination. It had reacted with it, creating new compounds that stained and marked and documented what had happened here with horrifying clarity. The bed was in the center of the room, and even from the doorway I could see the outline. Not the body itself, which had been removed, but the shadow of it, preserved in chemical staining that marked where decomposition had occurred. The mattress was destroyed, saturated with fluids that had mixed with the bleach to create a dark, tarry substance that had hardened into a crust. The walls around the bed showed splash patterns, arcing sprays of mixed biological and chemical material that had been thrown with force, suggesting violent movement or deliberate dispersal. And the smell, even through my CBRN filters, I could detect it. That sweet, sick odor of advanced decomposition merged with chemical sharpness into something that made my stomach clench. I set up my work lights and began the detailed documentation, photographing every surface, every stain pattern, every piece of evidence that told the story of what had happened here. The ATP luminometer was useless. The chemical contamination interfered with the readings, giving me nonsense numbers that fluctuated wildly depending on where I tested. But I didn't need the luminometer to tell me this room was heavily contaminated. I could see it, could smell it through the filters, could feel it in the way the air seemed thicker here, more resistant, like the space itself had been fundamentally altered by what had occurred and what had been done to conceal it. As I worked, I became aware of sounds beneath the hiss of my respirator. Soft sounds, subtle, like movement in the walls or floor. I paused, held my breath, listened there. A scratching, rhythmic and persistent coming from inside the wall cavity behind the bed. Rodents, probably drawn by the decomposition, now trapped in the walls and slowly dying from chemical exposure. I noted it in my documentation and continued working, but the scratching persisted, and gradually I realized it had a pattern to it, a cadence that felt almost intentional. 3 scratches, pause, 3 scratches, pause, over and over, like something was trying to communicate rather than simply trying to escape. I approached the wall and pressed my ear to it, and the scratching stopped immediately. Silence, complete and absolute, like whatever had been making the sound was now listening to me just as I had been listening to it. I stepped back, and after a moment the scratching resumed. 3 and pause, 3 and pause, metronomic and deliberate. I marked the location on my documentation and made a note to check the wall cavity during remediation. But something about that sound, about its sudden cessation when I'd gotten close, made the hair on my neck stand up despite the layers of protective equipment. The closet door was closed, and when I opened it, I found the source of some of the chemical smell. More bleach bottles, emptied and discarded, filling the closet floor 3 feet deep. But it was the walls of the closet that made me step back, that made me understand the true scope of what I was documenting. They were covered in writing, not words exactly, but symbols, diagrams, drawings scratched into the drywall with something sharp. Mathematical equations mixed with crude anatomical sketches, chemical formulas alongside what looked like ritual markings. The scratches were deep, desperate, carved into the wall with enough force to gouge the drywall down to the studs in places. I photographed every inch of the closet walls, trying to make sense of the markings. Some of it looked like chemistry, molecular diagrams, equations for reactions, calculations that might have been dosages or concentrations. Other parts were more disturbing, human figures drawn in stick form but labeled with medical terminology, arrows pointing to specific parts of the anatomy, notes about procedures or techniques written in handwriting that degraded from careful script at the top of the walls to frantic scrawling near the floor. Whoever had created these markings had been documenting something, recording information or planning something, and they'd done it in a closet in a death room while chemicals ate away at the evidence surrounding them. I found a name in the markings, written over and over in different sizes and pressures. Practice makes perfect. Practice makes perfect. Practice makes perfect. The repetition filled an entire section of wall, the words overlapping until they became a texture rather than text. And near the bottom, where the writing became almost illegible, a final phrase. Ready now? Ready to try again. Ready to succeed. I photographed it all, feeling my heart rate increase despite my training, despite my years of experience telling me that crime scenes are just puzzles to be documented and understood. This felt different. This felt like standing in the workshop of someone who'd been perfecting something terrible, someone who'd been preparing for an act they'd only accomplished after multiple attempts. The bathroom attached to the master bedroom was the worst. The coroner's report had mentioned the body was found in the bedroom, but the bathroom told a different story. The shower stall had been scrubbed with such aggression that the grout was missing in places. The tiles cracked from the force of the cleaning. But bleach doesn't erase everything. It reacts, it stains, it creates new compounds that can be more visible than what they're meant to conceal. I used a UV light to check for biological residues, and the shower lit up like a constellation, showing patterns of organic material that had been cleaned but not eliminated. The pattern was extensive, covering the walls and floor, concentrated near the drain but spreading to every corner of the enclosed space. This was the actual death scene. Whatever had happened, it had started here, in this shower, and only later had the body been moved to the bed. But why? Why would someone discover a death in the shower, clean it extensively, then relocate the deceased to the bedroom and call authorities? The pattern didn't make sense unless the death hadn't been discovered after the fact. Unless someone had been present during the death, had participated in it or caused it, and then had attempted to stage the scene to look like something else, something natural, something that occurred in sleep rather than in the shower under circumstances that would invite investigation. I collected samples from the shower, scraping residue from the grout lines where the cleaning had been less thorough. The material was tacky, resistant, mixed with the bleach into a paste-like substance that peeled away in sheets. I sealed each sample in evidence bags, labeled them meticulously, and tried to ignore the way they felt warm in my gloved hands despite coming from a cold room. Chemical reactions can generate heat, I told myself. The bleach breaking down organic material, the process still active even days after application. But the warmth felt wrong, felt more alive than chemistry should allow. The scratching in the walls had intensified. Now it was coming from multiple locations, behind the headboard, inside the closet, beneath the floor. The three-scratch pattern had evolved into something more complex, overlapping rhythms that created a kind of percussion, an unintentional music that filled the room with sound that shouldn't exist. I radioed the deputy and told him I was hearing structural settling, possibly rodent activity, nothing concerning. But I didn't believe my own words. The sounds were too coordinated, too responsive. When I moved, they followed. When I stood still, they surrounded me. When I spoke into the radio, they stopped completely, like whatever was making them was listening to every word. I needed to check the wall cavities, to understand what was creating those sounds and whether it was related to the contamination or just an unfortunate coincidence of pest intrusion. I selected a section of wall behind the bed where the scratching seemed most concentrated and used my utility knife to cut away a section of drywall. The blade sank in easily, the wall material softened by chemical exposure, and when I pulled the section free, the smell that emerged was indescribable, a concentration of decay and chemicals that made my respirator filters strain, made my eyes water despite the full-face protection. Inside the wall cavity was a plastic bag. Contractor-grade, heavy-duty, sealed with duct tape that had yellowed and loosened from chemical exposure. The bag was bulging, distended with contents that shifted when I reached in to extract it. I pulled it out carefully, noting its weight, maybe 15 pounds, maybe 20, and set it on the floor to document before opening. Through the translucent plastic, I could see shapes, organic forms that might have been. I stopped myself from speculating and simply photographed the bag from every angle, noting the location where I'd found it, the condition of the surrounding wall cavity, the evidence that there might be more bags concealed in other wall sections. I cut the tape seal and opened the bag, and the smell that emerged made me gag despite my chemical protection. Inside were organic materials degraded beyond easy identification but clearly biological in origin, mixed with what appeared to be medical waste, latex gloves, surgical masks, tubing that might have been for IV lines or drainage. The organic material had decomposed partially, then been preserved by chemical exposure, creating a kind of mummification that left everything recognizable in outline but destroyed in detail. I documented the contents without removing them, photographing each layer as I carefully shifted the materials with sterile forceps. Near the bottom of the bag, I found something that made my hands freeze. Teeth. Human teeth. At least a dozen of them, loose and scattered among the other materials. They were molars and incisors, some with fillings visible, all of them showing signs of having been extracted rather than naturally lost. I photographed them from every angle, then sealed the entire bag for transport to law enforcement. This had gone beyond a death scene that needed cleaning. This was evidence of crimes, possibly multiple crimes, hidden in the walls and concealed beneath layers of chemical destruction. I called the deputy and told him to contact detectives immediately, that what I was finding suggested criminal activity beyond the single death that had been reported. He responded that detectives were already en route, the coroner had flagged the case as suspicious based on what he'd seen, and my preliminary findings were confirming those suspicions. I was told to stop remediation work and preserve everything in place, to document but not disturb, to treat the entire structure as a crime scene rather than a contamination site. Over the next 3 hours, I worked methodically through the room, cutting away sections of drywall, checking wall cavities, documenting what I found. There were more bags. I found 7 in total, each containing similar mixtures of organic material and medical waste, each sealed and hidden within the wall structure. The bags were distributed throughout the room, placed deliberately in locations where they wouldn't be found during casual renovation or repair, where they could remain concealed for years unless someone specifically went looking for them. And in each bag, among the degraded materials, were teeth. evidence that this room had been used for something beyond simple occupancy, some purpose that involved medical procedures or worse, performed repeatedly over time. The forensic team arrived as I was documenting the final wall cavity. They brought specialists in chemical exposure, in biohazard containment, in evidence preservation under extreme conditions. They photographed everything I'd found, collected the bags and their contents, sampled the chemical residues and the biological staining. The lead detective took my statement, and I told him everything. The extent of the bleach contamination, the shower that appeared to be the actual death scene, the bags in the walls, the teeth. He listened without interruption, taking notes, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. What emerged over the following weeks of investigation was a story darker than I'd imagined. The deceased had been operating an unlicensed medical practice from the farmhouse, providing services to people who couldn't access legitimate health care, undocumented immigrants, people fleeing domestic violence, anyone desperate enough to accept treatment from someone without credentials or oversight. Most of his work had been minor: sutures for cuts, antibiotics for infections, basic care that probably saved lives despite being illegal. But he'd also performed procedures beyond his capability, attempts at dental work and minor surgeries that had sometimes gone catastrophically wrong. The bags on the walls were his failures, the patients who hadn't survived his treatments, concealed rather than reported, hidden in the structure of his own home where they would remain unless someone tore the walls down. The teeth were trophies, or possibly evidence he'd kept for reasons the investigation never fully determined. Perhaps to track his work, perhaps to remember his victims, perhaps for reasons that made sense only to someone willing to hide bodies in their own walls. The exact count of victims was never established. Some of the biological material in the bags was too degraded for identification. Some probably wasn't human at all, but rather practice subjects, animals he'd used to refine his techniques before attempting them on living patients. The death that had triggered the discovery had been one of his patients. The toxicology report revealed an anesthetic overdose, suggesting a procedure had gone wrong, that someone had died under his amateur care, and this time he hadn't been able to simply hide the body in the walls. So he'd attempted to clean the scene with industrial bleach, had tried to erase the evidence of what had happened in that shower, had moved the body to the bed to stage a natural death. Then he'd sealed himself in the house with the chemical fumes, probably intending to ventilate and call for help once the visible evidence was gone. But the chemical exposure had been too much. He'd collapsed from chlorine gas poisoning, and by the time neighbors reported the smell, both the practitioner and his final patient were dead. The investigation eventually identified biological material from at least 5 different individuals in the wall cavities, though only 2 could be matched to missing persons reports. The others remained unidentified, people who'd come to the farmhouse seeking help and had never left, people whose disappearances had never been reported because they were already invisible to the systems that might have looked for them. The practitioner himself had no criminal record, no history of violence, just a background in veterinary medicine that had somehow evolved into treating humans, then into hiding the evidence when those treatments failed. I completed my documentation and handed everything over to the forensic team, but I wasn't done with the house. Once the criminal investigation released the scene, I was called back to remediate, to clean what the detectives and evidence technicians had left behind. It took 4 weeks of intensive work, and even then, I wasn't certain I'd succeeded. The chemical contamination had penetrated too deeply, had reacted with the building materials in ways that made complete removal impossible. We tore out walls down to the studs, removed all the flooring, stripped the bathroom to its skeletal framing. We treated every exposed surface with neutralizing agents, sealed everything with encapsulants, and still the smell persisted, faint but detectable, a ghost of chlorine and decay that seemed to have bonded with the structure at a molecular level. The house was condemned in the end. The cost of remediation exceeded its value, and even if we'd managed to clean it completely, the history would have made it unsellable. The county seized it for unpaid taxes, and the last I heard, it was scheduled for demolition. But that was 2 years ago, and when I drove past the property last month, the house was still standing, still empty, still waiting for someone to make the final decision about its fate. The chemical smell was gone. I tested the air from the road and found normal readings, but something about the structure looked wrong, felt wrong, as if the building itself had been fundamentally altered by what had occurred within it. I think about that house more than I should, about the scratching I heard in the walls and what made those sounds. The official explanation was rodents drawn by the decomposition and then poisoned by the chemical exposure. But I remember how the scratching responded to my presence, how it stopped when I got close and resumed when I backed away, how it created patterns that felt intentional rather than random. I remember the 3-scratch rhythm, pause, 3-scratch rhythm, and how it evolved into something more complex as I documented the scene. And I remember the feeling that something was listening, that the sounds weren't just evidence of pest activity, but communication, an attempt by something to reach out from inside those walls and make its presence known. The teeth haunt me too. Not just their presence. I've encountered evidence of violence and concealment before, found remains hidden in unlikely places. But the quantity haunted me. The suggestion that the collection had been ongoing for years, that each tooth represented a patient who'd trusted the practitioner and paid for that trust with their life. The investigation determined some of the teeth had been extracted post-mortem, removed from the deceased as some kind of record-keeping or memorial. Others had been taken during life, part of the amateur dental procedures that had sometimes been the practitioner's legitimate work. But either way, they represented people who'd come to that farmhouse seeking help and had become part of its hidden collection, part of the concealed history that lived in its walls. The bleach bothers me most, though. The desperate, catastrophic attempt to erase evidence that only succeeded in preserving it differently. 50 gallons of industrial chemical, dumped into an enclosed space, creating toxic gases and chemical burns, reacting with biological material to create compounds that were more visible and more permanent than what they were meant to eliminate. It was the cleaning equivalent of a confession, an act so extreme it could only draw attention, could only make investigators look more closely at what was being concealed. But I understand the impulse, the panic that drives people to make catastrophically wrong decisions, the terror that overrides rational thought and leads to actions that compound problems rather than solving them. I won't go back to that property. The remediation is complete to the extent it can be, and if the house is eventually demolished, someone else can oversee that work. Because I've spent enough time in those rooms, breathed enough of that chemical air through my filters, heard enough of those scratching sounds that followed me through the structure. I've documented what was hidden there, collected the evidence that led to understanding, and I've reached the limit of what I can process from that experience. The house defeated me in a way, not in the technical work, which was executed properly, but in the psychological impact, in the weight of knowing what had been practiced and perfected in those rooms, what had been hidden in those walls, what had been preserved by the very chemicals meant to destroy it. The practitioner is dead, his illegal clinic dismantled, his hidden collection discovered and documented. The investigation is closed, the house condemned, the property sitting empty awaiting demolition that may never come. But the memory of that place persists, surfaces in moments when I'm trying to sleep, manifests in the way I approach other rural properties, other isolated structures where someone might have decided that isolation equals freedom from oversight and consequence. I hear the scratching sometimes in the quiet moments, that 3-beat rhythm that felt so much like communication. I smell the chlorine and decay combination that shouldn't exist but does, that mixture of desperate concealment and biological truth that no amount of chemical can fully eliminate. The forensic team's final report ran to 200 pages, documenting every finding, every piece of evidence, every connection they could establish between the concealed materials and the missing persons cases. But there was a final section, unmarked and filed separately, that detailed the anomalies. The sounds that multiple investigators reported hearing in the walls, the chemical readings that fluctuated in ways that didn't match any known compounds, the sense of presence that made experienced detectives uncomfortable spending time alone in the structure. This section wasn't included in the official documentation, wasn't presented in court or referenced in the case summary. It was just there, a record of experiences that didn't fit the narrative. Observations that suggested something beyond criminal activity had occurred in that house. I contributed to that unmarked section, documented the scratching I'd heard and its responsive quality, the way the sounds followed me and stopped when I got close, the rhythm that felt too intentional to be random pest activity. I noted the warmth of the samples despite the cold environment, the way the chemical smell seemed to intensify in response to investigation rather than diminishing over time. And I recorded my professional opinion that the house contained contamination beyond the biological and chemical, something that existed in the experience of the space rather than in measurable residues, something that made it unsuitable for future occupancy, regardless of how thoroughly it might be cleaned. But that opinion wasn't acted upon. The house stands empty, but intact, waiting for demolition that's been delayed by budget constraints and bureaucratic processes. The land beneath it is probably contaminated from chemical seepage, the groundwater possibly affected by decades of improper disposal. But those are environmental concerns, public health issues that can be measured and addressed through established protocols. What I experienced in that house, what others reported experiencing, doesn't fit into those frameworks. It exists in the gap between documented evidence and human perception, in the space where experience becomes unreliable testimony because it can't be verified by instruments or replicated under controlled conditions. So I stay away from the property, take different routes when jobs require me to work in that area, decline any contracts that might bring me back to the farmhouse or its immediate surroundings. Because some places embed themselves in your consciousness in ways that make return impossible, that create associations too strong to overcome through professional detachment or rational analysis. That farmhouse is one of those places for me. Not because of what I found there, though that was disturbing enough, but because of what I experienced there. The sounds and sensations that suggested presence beyond simple contamination, awareness beyond what should exist in an empty structure. The house will come down eventually, reduced to rubble and buried in a landfill, its materials dispersed and its history scattered. Maybe that will end whatever persists there, whatever made those sounds and created those sensations. Or maybe it will just relocate, find new walls to inhabit, new spaces to make uncomfortable. I don't know, and I'm not certain I want to know. Some questions create obligations to investigate, to follow evidence wherever it leads. But this question, what was making those sounds, what was creating that presence, is one I'm content to leave unanswered, to seal in that unmarked section of the forensic report where experiences go that don't fit the official narrative. That's the house I'll never enter again. Not because the work is incomplete. The remediation was as thorough as conditions allowed, and what remains is beyond my capability to address. But because the house changed something in how I perceive these spaces, in how I understand the relationship between what we clean and what persists despite cleaning. I learned in that farmhouse that bleach doesn't erase, it transforms. That concealment doesn't eliminate, it preserves in different forms, and that some presences exist beyond the biological, beyond the chemical, in the experience of a space that records and remembers what occurred within it, regardless of how thoroughly we try to eliminate the evidence. The chemical smell is gone now, neutralized by time and ventilation. The biological contamination is removed, bagged, and incinerated according to hazmat protocols. But the scratching continues if the reports are accurate, if the maintenance workers and county inspectors who occasionally visit the property are reliable witnesses. 3-scratch rhythm, pause, 3-scratch rhythm, coming from walls that are empty now, from cavities that contain nothing but air and darkness. The sound of something that refuses to be fully concealed, that persists despite the removal of its source, that makes its presence known in ways that can't be documented but can't be denied by those who hear it. That's what I carry from the farmhouse, not just the evidence I collected or the investigation I supported, but the understanding that some contamination exists beyond what we can measure and remove. The house taught me that death leaves traces in more than biological material, that desperate acts of concealment create presences that outlast their physical components, that the scratching I heard was less about what was in the walls and more about what the walls themselves had become through years of hiding what should have been revealed. And once you've heard that sound, once you've recognized it as something beyond simple rodent activity, you can't unhear it. It becomes part of how you listen to empty houses, part of what you're alert for in the silence between documented sounds. So the farmhouse remains on my list of places I won't return to, won't enter even if called back for final demolition oversight or post-removal verification. Let someone else stand in those rooms and hear the scratching. Let someone else decide whether it's simply pests or something more persistent. I've contributed what I can to understanding that place, and I've reached the limit of what I'm willing to experience in exchange for that understanding. The house has kept some of its secrets, and I'm content to let them remain hidden, to accept that complete remediation isn't always possible, that some contamination is too deeply embedded to fully eliminate. The investigation closed with partial answers and unidentified victims, with some justice served but questions remaining. The house stands condemned but not demolished, existing in a state between occupancy and erasure. And I continue my work in other places, cleaning other scenes, always listening now for sounds that don't quite fit, for presences that exist beyond what should be there. The farmhouse changed my practice in ways subtle but significant, made me more attentive to what persists despite cleaning, more aware that my work addresses only one layer of contamination while others remain beyond my protocol's reach. That's why I'll never go back. Because I've learned what I needed to learn from that house, and further exposure would only deepen associations I'm already struggling to manage. The scratching follows me sometimes, manifests in the quiet moments, that 3-beat rhythm that felt like communication from something that wanted to be heard despite being hidden. I hear it, acknowledge it, and move forward with my work. But I won't return to its source, won't stand again in those chemically scarred rooms and listen to the walls reveal what should have been cleaned away, but somehow persists. The bleach house remains, for now, a monument to failed concealment and persistent presence. And I remain at a distance, carrying its lessons but refusing its invitation to return, to investigate further, to attempt remediation of contamination that exists beyond the biological and chemical. Some houses defeat us not through the scope of their contamination, but through the nature of it, through presences that resist documentation and removal. That farmhouse was one such defeat, and I accept it as a limit to my practice, a boundary beyond which my expertise and equipment cannot effectively operate. So it stands, and I stay away, and the scratching continues for those willing to hear it. That's the final truth of that place. Not what was hidden there, though that was terrible enough, but what persists despite discovery, what makes its presence known regardless of how thoroughly we clean, how completely we document, how desperately we try to erase what occurred within those walls. The contamination is permanent, embedded in the structure and the experience of it, beyond any protocol's power to eliminate. And acknowledging that permanence, accepting that some places cannot be fully remediated, is perhaps the only honest conclusion to draw from my time in the bleach house. The contractor's voice on the phone was shaking, and that alone should have warned me. I'm Eulalie Finch Rowntree, and I've been cleaning death scenes for 13 years, long enough to recognize fear in someone's voice, to distinguish between ordinary disgust and the kind of visceral horror that comes from discovering something fundamentally wrong with the world. He kept saying, "You need to see this," instead of describing what he'd found, kept circling back to the phrase, "It shouldn't be like this," without explaining what this was or how it should have been instead. When I asked him to describe the scene, there was a long pause filled with the sound of his breathing, rapid and shallow, before he said, "Just come. Please, I can't be alone with this anymore." The address was in Shaw, a neighborhood of narrow row houses pressed together like books on a shelf, each one 3 stories tall and maybe 15 feet wide. The renovation site was mid-block, scaffolding covering its brick facade, a dumpster in the alley filled with plaster and lath from the gutting process. I arrived just after sunset, the streetlights creating long shadows that made the construction site look less like a home being remodeled and more like a skeleton being slowly excavated. The contractor met me at the door, a man in his 50s with plaster dust in his beard and eyes that wouldn't quite focus on mine, that kept sliding away to look at something over my shoulder or past my head. He led me inside without speaking, through the first floor that had been stripped to studs, wiring hanging in loops like vines, old brick walls exposed where plaster had been removed. The smell hit me on the stairs, not the sharp stench of recent death, but something older, more complex, a layered odor that spoke to multiple events over time. It was organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in water, like something sweet that had turned but not quite rotted. The contractor noticed my reaction and nodded grimly. "Wait until you get to the 3rd floor," he said. "That's where we found it. That's where it's been waiting, I guess, if that makes sense." The 3rd floor was a disaster of half-completed demolition. They'd torn out the old ductwork, modern HVAC being installed to replace the ancient radiator system, and sections of the ceiling hung open, exposing the space between floors. The contractor pointed to a blue tarp spread on the floor, lumpy with something underneath, and I could see his hand trembling as he gestured. "We were pulling the main duct line," he said quietly. "When we disconnected it, this came out. Just poured out of the opening like it had been waiting there for years, just accumulating, just collecting in the dark where no one would see." He wouldn't look at the tarp, kept his eyes on the wall as he spoke. I covered it up because I couldn't stand looking at it, but I can still see it when I close my eyes. I think I'll always see it now. I pulled on my gloves and approached the tarp, and even before I lifted the corner, I knew this was going to be different from anything I'd encountered before. The smell intensified as I got closer, that sweet, wrong odor concentrated here to the point where I could taste it. I lifted the tarp and understood immediately why the contractor's voice had been shaking. The pile beneath was biological, definitely human in origin, but transformed by time and environment into something that looked almost artificial in its preservation. Thin sheets of desiccated tissue, brittle as old paper, mixed with hair that still held together in clumps, fragments that might have been I stopped cataloging and just documented, photographing from every angle before I let myself think too hard about what I was seeing. I set up my work lights and began the careful examination, using forceps to separate the materials. The tissue was dried to the point of being almost translucent, like parchment, and when I held it up to the light I could see the fine network of what had once been cells, now just a pattern in desiccated organic matter. But this wasn't simple decomposition. The preservation was too complete, the materials too intact. This had been in an environment that prevented normal decay, that mummified rather than rotted, that kept everything suspended in a state between death and dust. I collected samples, labeled them, and tried to ignore the way the contractor had backed into the hallway, couldn't bear to be in the room while I worked. I checked the ductwork itself, feeding a fiber optic camera up into the metal passage to see what remained inside. The screen showed more of the same material, coating the interior of the ducts, pressed against the metal by years of forced air circulation. But there was a pattern to it, a distribution that suggested... I pulled the camera out and checked my readings. The biological contamination wasn't random. It was concentrated in specific areas of the duct system, places where the airflow would have naturally deposited and accumulated materials. Someone or something had been distributed through this ventilation system, spread piece by piece through the house over time, circulated by the HVAC that was meant to provide comfort and clean air. The contractor appeared in the doorway, wouldn't come closer but needed to speak. "There's more," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the walls. In the floors. We found places. Spaces where things were hidden. We stopped opening walls after the second one because nobody wanted to find a third." He pulled out his phone and showed me photos. Wall cavities with objects inside, things wrapped in plastic, bundles that had been carefully concealed behind the plaster and lath. "I called you before we called the police because I needed to know if this was what I thought it was, if I was right to be scared." I asked him to show me the walls they'd opened, and he led me down to the second floor, moving quickly like he didn't want to spend more time near these discoveries than absolutely necessary. The first wall cavity was in the bathroom, behind where the toilet had been. They'd removed the fixture to upgrade the plumbing and found the wall behind it had been modified. A section of plaster carefully cut out and then replaced, creating a hidden compartment in the wall structure. Inside was a package wrapped in heavy plastic, sealed with tape that had yellowed and begun to separate with age. Through the translucent plastic I could see fabric, clothing that had been stained and then stored, preserved here in the dark where no one would think to look. The second location was in a bedroom, behind the wall where a headboard would have been positioned. Same careful modification, same hidden compartment, same plastic-wrapped package. But this one was different, larger, bulkier, and when I looked closer I could see text through the plastic, writing in marker that had bled through over time. I couldn't make out the words completely, but I could see dates, times, what might have been names or initials. This wasn't just concealment. This was documentation, a record being kept of something that someone wanted both hidden and remembered. I went back to the third floor and examined the ductwork opening more carefully, understanding now that this wasn't a single event, but a system, a method of disposal that had been used repeatedly over time. The materials I'd found weren't from one source. They were accumulated from multiple events, each one contributing to the collection in the ducts, each one adding to the biological residue that had been circulating through the house's air for who knows how many years. The thought made my skin crawl, not just what had been done, but the fact that people had lived here, breathed this air, gone about their daily lives while the ventilation system distributed particles of someone's concealed victims through every room. I called the police, explained what had been found, and within an hour, the house was swarming with investigators. They brought in specialists, forensic teams, cadaver dogs that alerted in multiple locations throughout the structure. Over the next 3 days, they systematically opened every wall, checked every cavity, examined every space where something might have been hidden. What they found turned the renovation site into a crime scene that would take months to fully process. The final count was 7 locations, 7 hidden compartments throughout the house, each containing evidence of violence, each carefully sealed and concealed within the structure. But it was the ductwork that became the focus of the investigation, the biological material that had been distributed through the ventilation system. Lab analysis eventually identified cellular material from at least 5 different individuals, though creating full profiles from such degraded samples was impossible. The working theory was that someone had used the house for terrible purposes over a period of years, and when disposal became necessary, they'd use the duct system as a kind of crematorium, breaking down materials and allowing the forced air to carry them away piece by piece, distributing the evidence so thoroughly that it became invisible, just another component of the dust that accumulates in any HVAC system. The property records showed the house had been owned by the same person from 1987 to 2003, someone who had listed their occupation as estate services, which the investigation revealed was a small business specializing in cleaning properties after deaths. It was a perfect cover, a legitimate reason to have access to biological materials, to possess industrial cleaning equipment, to understand how decomposition worked, and how to interrupt or conceal it. The business had operated quietly for 16 years before the owner sold the house and disappeared, relocating out of state with no forwarding address, no traceable presence beyond the business registration that had been allowed to lapse. I was asked to stay on and document the biological findings, to help the forensic team understand the distribution patterns and what they suggested about the timeline of events. I spent 2 weeks in that house, carefully extracting materials from the ductwork, sampling the hidden compartments, mapping the locations and trying to understand the logic of the concealment. And during those 2 weeks, I began to notice things that didn't make it into the official reports, observations that fell into the category of experience rather than evidence. The house made sounds at night. I'd be working alone on the 3rd floor, everyone else having left for the evening, and I'd hear movement below me. Footsteps on stairs, doors closing, the creak of floorboards under weight. I'd check, find nothing, return to work. But the sounds would continue, always just out of sight, always in the room I'd just left or was about to enter. The other investigators mentioned it too, casually at first and then more seriously as the experiences accumulated. One detective refused to work alone in the building after the 3rd night, said she'd heard breathing in the wall cavities, heard it respond when she spoke, heard it move through the structure following her from room to room. I started documenting these experiences separately, keeping a personal log of the anomalies. The temperature fluctuations that didn't correspond to HVAC function, sudden cold spots that moved through rooms, areas of warmth that shouldn't exist in an unheated building, the smells that appeared and disappeared without source, that sweet, wrong odor concentrating in specific locations, then dissipating when you tried to identify its origin, the sense of being watched, of occupied space, of presence that multiple people reported independently without discussing it with each other first. On the 8th night, working alone, because I'd fallen behind on documentation and needed to catch up, I found something that wasn't in any of the hidden compartments, wasn't part of the official crime scene. I was examining the ductwork in the basement, the main trunk lines that fed the entire system, when I noticed a section that had been modified. Someone had cut an access panel into the duct, carefully sealed it afterward, creating a maintenance opening that wasn't part of the original installation. I opened it and found a notebook inside, wrapped in plastic, pages filled with handwriting that documented something between a diary and a ledger. The entries were dated, spanning from 1989 to 2002, each one describing an event in clinical language that made the content somehow worse. Descriptions of people who'd come to the house seeking help, services provided, complications that had arisen, decisions made about disposal. But interspersed with these clinical notes were other entries, more personal, that described experiences in the house. The writer talked about feeling observed, about hearing sounds that shouldn't exist, about the sense that the house was holding on to what had happened within it, that the structure itself was becoming a kind of repository not just for physical materials but for the events themselves. The final entry, dated March 2003, just before the house was sold, was different in tone from all the others. The handwriting was erratic, the language desperate. It won't let me leave. I've tried to close the business, tried to sell, tried to move on. But every night I hear them in the walls. Not sounds, them. All of them. They're here and they won't let me forget, and I can't stay, but I can't leave. The house has what I gave it, and it wants more. It will always want more. Anyone who lives here will feel it. Anyone who opens these walls will release it. I should burn it down, but I can't. It won't let me. So I'm leaving, and sealing everything, and maybe someday someone will understand what I've created here. Not just the hiding places, those can be found, but the other thing, the presence, the collection of moments that won't end just because I stop adding to them. I photographed every page of the notebook and then sat with it for a long time, trying to decide what to do with this information. It was evidence, clearly documentation that could help identify victims and possibly locate the person who'd written it. But it was also something else, a testament to experiences similar to what the current investigators were reporting, a suggestion that whatever we were feeling in this house had been present for decades, had been fed and maintained by the activities that occurred here, and wouldn't necessarily end just because those activities had stopped. I gave the notebook to the lead detective, explained where I'd found it and what it contained. She read it, expression growing darker with each page, and then asked me if I believed the later entries, the ones about the house holding on to events, about presence that persisted. I told her the truth, that multiple trained investigators were reporting similar experiences, that the pattern of observations was consistent enough to warrant documentation, even if it didn't fit conventional evidence categories. She nodded slowly and added the notebook to the evidence logs, but I noticed it ended up in a sealed file, not part of the main case documentation, kept separate like the experiences it described. The forensic analysis continued for weeks after I completed my documentation and left the site. They identified connections to 5 missing persons cases from the 1990s, people who'd disappeared without explanation and been presumed to have left the area voluntarily. The notebook helped establish timeline and method, provided enough information to close those cases as homicides even without recovered bodies. The person who'd written the notebook was never located. They'd effectively vanished after selling the house, leaving no trail, no records, no presence beyond what was hidden in the walls of that row house in Shaw. But the renovation never completed. The contractor abandoned the project, forfeited his deposit, walked away from months of work rather than spend another day in that building. The property owner tried to hire other contractors, but word had spread through the construction community and no one would take the job. The house sat half-gutted for a year, exposed studs and open walls, ductwork removed but never replaced. A skeleton of a structure that nobody wanted to finish bringing back to life. Eventually, it was condemned, the cost of completion combined with its history making it economically unsalvageable. I drove past it once, about 6 months after I'd finished my work there, and saw that someone had broken in, probably homeless people seeking shelter, maybe curious teenagers drawn by the property's dark reputation. The windows were broken now, the door hanging open, the scaffolding still in place like a cage around something that needed containing. I sat in my car looking at it and remembered the sounds I'd heard, the sense of being watched, the feeling that the house was aware of investigation and was responding to it in subtle ways that couldn't be documented but couldn't be ignored. What bothers me most about that house isn't what we found, the hidden compartments, the ductwork deposits, the notebook with its clinical documentation of terrible things. What bothers me is what we couldn't find, what wasn't in any hiding place or any documentation. The notebook mentioned all of them being in the walls, but we only identified 5 individuals' biological materials. Where were the others? What had been so completely destroyed or concealed that even thorough forensic investigation couldn't detect it? And why did it feel like those missing pieces were still present somehow, still occupying the space even though we couldn't measure or document their existence? The detective who read the notebook called me 3 months after the case officially closed. She'd been having dreams about the house, she said, about walking through it and hearing voices in the walls, about opening ductwork and finding not materials but something else, something that existed in the gap between physical evidence and psychological impression. She wanted to know if I'd experienced similar dreams, if the house had followed me home the way it had followed her. I told her yes, that I'd been dreaming about it regularly, that the dreams were consistent enough to seem less like random neurological firing and more like memory, like the house was maintaining a connection to everyone who'd worked there, everyone who'd learned its secrets. We talked about whether we should report these experiences, add them to the case file as some kind of psychological aftermath notation. But what would we report? That a house where terrible things happened seemed to retain some quality of those events, some presence that affected people even after the physical evidence was removed. That sounds made by settling structures and temperature fluctuations from poor insulation felt intentional, felt responsive, felt like communication from something that wanted to maintain its existence in our awareness. No formal documentation process exists for observations like that. They exist in the gap between professional experience and personal impact, in the space where the work follows you home and becomes part of how you understand the world. I still have the samples I collected from that house, the materials extracted from the ductwork and the wall cavities, all properly sealed and labeled and stored. They've been tested, analyzed, documented in the official reports, but I know they don't tell the complete story, that the biological materials are just one component of what that house contained. The other components, the experiences, the sounds, the sense of presence, those can't be stored in evidence bags or analyzed in laboratories. They exist only in the memories of people who spent time in that structure, who felt its particular quality of occupied space, who heard the sounds that shouldn't exist, and felt the temperature changes that violated thermodynamic principles. The house in Shaw sits abandoned now, slowly collapsing from neglect and exposure, its renovation abandoned and its future uncertain. The city has plans to demolish it eventually, to clear the lot and allow something new to be built on the space. But I wonder if demolition will eliminate what exists there, or if it will just relocate it, spread it to wherever the materials are taken, to whatever fills the empty lot afterward. Because what I learned in that house is that some things don't need physical structure to persist, that presence can exist independent of the materials that originally housed it, that the worst contamination isn't biological, but experiential, isn't what we can measure, but what we can feel. That's why I'll never go back to Shaw, never drive down that block, never allow myself to see what's become of the structure I spent 2 weeks documenting and understanding. Because I know it would still feel occupied, would still emanate that sense of collected moments, would still seem to be aware of my presence and responsive to it in ways I couldn't document but couldn't deny. The physical evidence is collected and filed. The investigation is closed. The case is solved to the extent it can be solved. But the house remains in a different sense, remains in the dreams and memories of everyone who worked there, remains as a kind of psychological location that we all carry regardless of what happens to the physical structure. The contractor never worked in that neighborhood again. The detective transferred to a different division, wanted separation from the case and what it had revealed. And I added Shaw to my list of places I won't accept jobs, areas I avoid when routing my day, neighborhoods that exist for me now primarily as reminders of what houses can become when they're used for purposes that violate their essential nature as shelters and homes. Because that row house taught me something fundamental about my work, that cleaning doesn't always mean eliminating, that documentation doesn't always mean understanding, and that some spaces hold on to their history in ways that transcend physical evidence and enter the realm of persistent experience. The sounds still follow me sometimes. Those footsteps and closing doors always just out of sight, always in spaces I've just left or am about to enter. I hear them most often late at night, when I'm alone with my thoughts and my memories of scenes I've worked, and I recognize them now as belonging to that house in Shaw, to the structure that collected terrible moments and wouldn't release them, that distributed evidence through its ventilation system and maintained presence through some quality that exists beyond biology and chemistry. The sounds are a reminder that some houses defeat us not through the scope of their contamination, but through its nature, through the way it persists despite all attempts at removal and remediation. I documented everything I found in that house, everything I could measure and photograph and seal in evidence bags. But the complete documentation exists in a different form, in the experiences of people who worked there and felt what couldn't be measured, who heard what shouldn't exist and saw patterns in coincidence that suggested intention. That documentation is scattered across our individual memories, our dreams, our reluctance to discuss what we experienced for fear of seeming unprofessional or unreliable. It's a documentation that exists in absence and avoidance, in the routes that we take that bypass certain neighborhoods, in the jobs we decline without fully explaining why. The house in Shaw is that kind of documentation for me. Not a crime scene I cleaned, but an experience I carry, not evidence I collected, but awareness I can't eliminate. It exists in my decision never to return, in my dreams that replay variations of what I found there, in my understanding that some contamination is permanent not because we can't remove it, but because it transforms us in the process of encountering it. The biological materials are sealed and stored. The investigation is closed, but the house persists in the psychology of everyone who learned its secrets, and that persistence is beyond any protocol's power to address. So when people ask me about difficult cases, about scenes that challenged my expertise or tested my resolve, I think about that house in Shaw, but I don't talk about it, because the truth of what I found there, the complete truth, including the experiences that don't fit evidence categories, is something that exists in the gap between professional documentation and personal impact. It's a truth that makes sense only to those who've encountered similar presences, similar qualities of space that suggest awareness and intention beyond what dead structures should possess. And it's a truth that keeps me away from that neighborhood, from that block, from any reminder of the house where I learned that cleaning is sometimes just the beginning of understanding, not its conclusion. The renovation will never complete. The house will eventually fall or be demolished, but what it contained, what it collected and maintained and distributed through its ventilation system, will persist in other forms, in memories and dreams, in avoidance and reluctance, in the way certain spaces feel occupied even when they're empty, in the sounds that shouldn't exist but do, in the presence that defies measurement but demands acknowledgement. That's the legacy of the house in Shaw, the contamination that outlasts its physical source, the truth that exists beyond what can be documented in official reports or sealed in evidence bags. And that's why I'll never enter it again, why I've added it to my permanent list of avoided places, why I take routes that ensure I never have to see what's become of that structure. Because I know what I'd find there. Not new evidence or overlooked materials, but the same presence I documented in my personal logs, the same sounds and temperature changes and sense of being watched. The house would still be occupied in the ways that matter, still maintaining what it collected, still refusing to release what it holds regardless of how thoroughly we tried to clean it, or how completely we thought we understood it. Some houses are like that. They become more than structures, more than crime scenes, more than locations on a map. They become experiences that persist independent of their physical existence. Contaminations that spread through awareness rather than contact. Presences that live in the psychology of everyone who encountered them. That's the house I'll never enter again. Not the physical structure in Shaw that's slowly collapsing, but the experiential location that exists in memory and dream, in avoidance and reluctance, in the gap between what I can document and what I know to be true. The investigation is closed, the evidence is filed, but the house remains active in ways that official reports don't acknowledge, in the spaces between what we can prove and what we've experienced. And acknowledging that persistence, accepting it as a limit to what cleaning can achieve, is perhaps the most honest response to what I found in that renovation site, where someone had tried to turn a house into a hiding place and accidentally created something that would never fully release what it held. I received a call 6 months after the case closed from a woman who'd lived in one of the neighboring row houses during the 1990s. She'd read about the investigation in the news and wanted to tell me something she'd never reported to police, something she'd tried to convince herself was imagination, but could no longer dismiss. She described hearing sounds through the shared wall, not voices exactly, but rhythmic tapping, always in sequences of 3, always late at night. She'd hear it for weeks at a time, then silence for months, then it would start again. The pattern had continued for years, from 90 until 2003, when the house was sold and the sounds finally stopped. But here's what made my blood run cold. She described the sound as communicative, as responsive. When she'd tap back on the wall in frustration, wanting the noise to stop, the pattern would change. It would mimic her knocking, would answer in the same rhythm she'd used. She'd tried to convince herself it was the neighbor doing home repairs at odd hours, but the responses were too immediate, too precise. And once, when she'd gotten angry and pounded on the wall shouting for silence, the answering taps had come from multiple locations simultaneously. Too many points of origin for one person to create. Spreading across the wall, like something was moving through the structure itself, acknowledging her presence from every possible position. I asked her if she'd ever met the neighbor during those years, if she'd ever seen who lived in the house. She said no. The curtains were always drawn, the door always closed, and on the rare occasion she'd encountered someone leaving or entering, they'd moved quickly, face turned away, actively avoiding interaction. She'd thought it was just someone who valued privacy, someone who worked odd hours and didn't want neighborhood socializing. But now, knowing what had been happening in that house, knowing what had been hidden in the walls and circulated through the air, she understood that the avoidance had been intentional, that whoever lived there couldn't risk being known, being remembered, being connected to what they were doing. She asked me if I thought the tapping had been a signal, if someone in that house had been trying to communicate, trying to call for help through the only means available to them. I didn't know how to answer that. The timeline suggested the tapping had occurred during the years when the notebook documented active operations. If someone had been signaling, had been alive and aware enough to tap patterns on walls, why hadn't they escaped? Why hadn't they made more obvious attempts to attract attention? Unless the tapping wasn't from the living. Unless what she'd heard was something else. The house itself processing what it held, creating sounds as some kind of byproduct of collecting and containing what had been given to it. That conversation changed how I understood the house in Shaw. I'd thought of it as a passive repository, a structure that had been used for terrible purposes and had somehow retained an imprint of those events. But the neighbor's account suggested something more active, more intentional. The house had been responding to presence, had been communicating in its way, had been making its occupation known to anyone paying attention. The 3-tap pattern she described was too similar to what I'd heard in the walls during my investigation, too identical to ignore the connection. Whatever created those sounds in the 90s was creating them still, was maintaining its presence through the only language available to something that exists between physical and experiential reality. I documented this conversation in my personal files, added it to the unofficial record of experiences that didn't fit the case narrative. And I started researching the property's history before 1987, before the person with the notebook had owned it. What I found suggested that the house's wrongness predated its use as a hiding place, that perhaps the person documented in the notebook had been drawn to a structure that already possessed the qualities they needed, a house that could hold secrets, that could contain what was given to it, that could maintain presence beyond what physical evidence alone would allow. The property records showed a succession of short-term owners before 1987, no one staying more than a few years, most leaving without selling, simply abandoning their equity and walking away. There were complaints filed with the city, noise disturbances, strange odors, reports of tapping in walls that investigations never substantiated. One owner in 1979 had petitioned to have the house demolished, claiming it was structurally unsound, but inspections found nothing wrong with the building's integrity. The petition was denied, and 3 months later that owner disappeared, leaving the house to be sold for unpaid taxes. This pattern of short ownership and abandonment suggested something fundamental about the structure, some quality that made it unsuitable for normal habitation even before it was used for explicitly terrible purposes. And it raised a disturbing possibility that the person documented in the notebook hadn't created what the house became, but had recognized what it already was and decided to use those existing qualities for their own ends. They'd found a house that could hold secrets and had given it secrets to hold, had found a structure that maintained presence and had fed that presence with exactly what it seemed to want. The residue of lives ended within its walls. The neighboring woman's description of the responsive tapping, the way it had answered her frustrations and mirrored her patterns, suggested intelligence of a kind, awareness that existed in the structure itself. Not consciousness in any conventional sense, but something else. A quality of reactivity, of engagement with the living, of desire to maintain connection even when the source of that connection had been removed. The house in Shaw had learned from what was given to it, had developed responses based on years of exposure to specific patterns of event and concealment. And now, even with its purpose ended and its contents discovered, it continued those responses, continued the tapping and the sounds and the sense of occupied space because that's what it had become, what it knew how to be. I tried to discuss this theory with the lead detective, but she was uninterested in speculation beyond what could be proven and documented. The case was closed, the evidence was filed, and she'd moved on to new investigations that didn't follow her into dreams or create persistent unease. But I couldn't move on so easily. The house in Shaw had become a question I couldn't answer, a puzzle with pieces that existed beyond what physical investigation could reach. And the more I learned about its history, the more convinced I became that what we'd found, the hidden compartments and ductwork deposits, were just symptoms of something deeper, something that had existed in that structure long before anyone decided to use it for concealment. The demolition date has been set and postponed 3 times now. Each contractor who's hired to do the work visits the site, assesses the job, and then finds reasons to withdraw their bid. The official explanations are always practical: unexpected structural complications, scheduling conflicts, equipment unavailability. But I've spoken to 2 of these contractors privately, and they admit the real reason. The house feels wrong. They describe the same experiences everyone else has reported. Sounds that shouldn't exist, temperature changes without source, the sense of being watched and assessed by something that resents their presence. One contractor told me he'd never demolished an empty building that felt so thoroughly occupied, so resistant to the idea of ending. So the house stands, waiting for demolition that may never come, slowly deteriorating from exposure and neglect. The windows are all broken now, the roof has holes, weather is getting in and accelerating the decay. But according to the city inspector's reports, the structure remains sound. The bones of the building, the fundamental framing and foundation, show no signs of the weakness that weather damage should have caused. It's as if the house is maintaining itself at some minimal level, keeping itself viable despite abandonment, refusing to fall even as it's being actively destroyed by the elements. I drive past it sometimes now, unable to completely avoid the neighborhood despite my earlier resolution. And each time I see it, I notice something new. A window that seems less broken than before. A section of roof that looks more intact. Shadows in the interior that suggest movement where no movement should occur. These observations might be tricks of light and perspective. Might be my mind finding patterns in randomness. But they feel consistent with everything else I know about that house. Consistent with its history of maintaining presence, of refusing to release what it holds, of existing in ways that transcend its physical structure. The house in Shaw is still occupied, still collecting, still maintaining what was given to it over decades of misuse. The biological evidence is removed, the investigation is closed, but the essential quality of the place persists, in the sounds that contractors hear, in the sense of resistance to demolition, in the way it maintains structural integrity despite abandonment. It exists now primarily as experience rather than location, as memory rather than address, as a persistent question that has no answer beyond acceptance that some spaces become more than the sum of their physical components. And that's the final truth I carry from that renovation site. Not just what was found in the walls and ducts, not just the terrible history documented in the notebook, but the understanding that houses can become something other than shelter, can develop qualities that persist beyond their use, can maintain presence that outlasts any attempt at cleaning or closure. The row house in Shaw taught me that some contamination is permanent, not because we lack the tools to remove it, but because it transforms the space itself into something that will always carry what it held. Will always respond to presence, will always tap back when approached, will always maintain the collection it was given even after that collection has been removed.